Welcome back to Untold Crime Legends. Today's story takes us deep into Harlem's underworld, to a single moment so fast, so loud. It changed everything when Bumpy Johnson's bodyguard pulled the trigger at point-blank range. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because every story here is built on hours of digging through real records, testimonies, and verified historical data to bring you the truth behind the legends. Not rumors, not myths, just untold crime history. Bumpy Johnson, born Ellsworth Raymond Johnson in 1905, was far more than just a Harlem gangster. He was a symbol of power, contradiction, and survival in a racially divided America. Raised in South Carolina before moving to Harlem as a teenager, Johnson arrived in New York at a time when the neighborhood was becoming the cultural and political heart of Black America. Early on, he learned that respect in Harlem wasn't given, it was taken, defended, and maintained. Johnson earned the nickname Bumpy from a noticeable bump on the back of his head, but the name soon became synonymous with fear and authority. He rose through the criminal ranks during the Harlem Renaissance, navigating an era where black criminals were often controlled by white mobsters. Unlike many others, Bumpy refused to be a puppet. He was intelligent, strategic, and unafraid to challenge those who underestimated him. What separated Bumpy Johnson from other crime figures was his mind. He was known to read Shakespeare, philosophy, and history, even while serving long prison sentences. Guards and inmates alike spoke about his calm demeanor and sharp intellect. He wasn't reckless. Every move he made was calculated, and every alliance served a purpose. Violence was a tool, not a habit. Bumpy's most controversial alliance was with Italian mafia boss Vincent, the Chin, Gigante, and later with Lucky Luciano's crime family network. While Harlem was technically under Italian control, Bumpy negotiated a rare position of autonomy, allowing black-run operations to exist with limited interference. This made him both respected and resented, respected by those who benefited and feared by those who didn't. Despite his criminal empire, Bumpy Johnson was seen by many Harlem residents as a protector. He reportedly paid rent for struggling families, ensured local businesses weren't preyed upon by outsiders, and punished those who harmed people in the neighborhood without cause. To some, he was a criminal. To others, he was a Robin Hood figure operating in a system that offered few legal paths to power. Law enforcement viewed Bumpy as untouchable, not because he was invisible, but because he was insulated. Witnesses rarely talked, evidence disappeared, and those who crossed him often vanished from the streets. He spent nearly half his life in prison, yet every time he returned, his influence was still intact. Harlem waited for him, and his enemies feared his release. By the time of the shooting that would change history, Bumpy Johnson was no longer just a man, he was an institution. His name carried weight in back rooms, on street corners, and inside prison walls. Understanding who Bumpy Johnson really was is essential, because the moment that followed wasn't random violence. It was the result of decades of power, loyalty, and consequences colliding in a single shot. Bumpy Johnson's most trusted bodyguard was not just muscle, he was an extension of Bumpy's will. In Harlem's underworld, loyalty was rare and betrayal was common, which made this role one of the most dangerous positions imaginable. The bodyguard wasn't chosen for size alone, but for discipline, silence, absolute devotion. Standing beside Bumpy meant standing in the line of fire, both literally and figuratively. This bodyguard handled what Bumpy could not be seen doing himself. He scouted rooms before meetings, identified threats in crowded clubs, made sure Bumpy was never surprised. In a world where a single misstep could mean death, the bodyguard's instincts were often the difference between survival and assassination. He watched hands, eyes, and movements, always anticipating violence before it happened. Trust between Bumpy and his bodyguard was built over years, not words. He was privy to sensitive conversations, secret locations, and internal conflicts within Harlem's criminal network. One mistake, one leak, and both men would be dead. That level of access meant the bodyguard was more than protection. He was a gatekeeper to Bumpy himself. The bodyguard also enforced Bumpy's authority when Bumpy chose not to appear personally. His presence alone sent a message. Orders were not suggestions. When disputes escalated, the bodyguard became the visible reminder of consequences. Many conflicts ended simply because he had arrived, his reputation already doing the work. Violence, when it came, was swift and decisive. The bodyguard understood that hesitation was fatal. He was trained by experience, not manuals, learning when to intimidate, when to intervene, and when to pull the trigger. In Harlem's code, acting too late was just as dangerous as acting too soon. The moment the trigger was pulled at point blank range was not an emotional outburst. It was a calculated act rooted in duty. The bodyguard acted because that was his role: eliminate the threat before it reached Bumpy. In that instant, personal morality disappeared, replaced by loyalty and survival. After the shot, the bodyguard faded into silence, much like many figures who operated in Bumpy Johnson's shadow. His name was rarely spoken, his story fragmented, but his actions echoed through Harlem's streets. That single decision cemented his place in history, not as a leader, as the man who carried out the moment that changed everything. During Bumpy Johnson's rise, Harlem was a battleground disguised as a neighborhood. On the surface, it was the cultural capital of Black America, alive with jazz, writers, and political thought. Beneath that surface, however, power was divided by money, fear, and control. Whoever controlled gambling, numbers running, and protection rackets controlled Harlem's real economy, and that economy operated largely outside the law. At the top of the hierarchy sat the Italian mafia, which held ultimate authority over most organized crime in New York City. Harlem, despite being predominantly black, was not exempt from this control. Italian crime families dictated terms, collected tribute, and decided who could operate and who couldn't. Black gangsters were often allowed to function only if they stayed profitable and obedient. Bumpy Johnson disrupted that balance. Instead of outright rebellion, he negotiated power. Through strategic alliances, intimidation, and reliability, he carved out a rare position of semi-independence. Harlem became one of the few areas where a black crime boss operated with a degree of autonomy, answering to the mafia but not controlled by them day to day. This made Bumpy both valuable and dangerous to higher powers. Below the major players were local crews, street-level operators who ran corners, clubs, and betting spots. Loyalty among these groups was fragile, alliances shifted quickly, and violence was often used to settle even minor disputes. Respect was currency, and fear was enforcement. Anyone who appeared weak didn't last long. Corrupt officials also played a quiet but critical role. Certain police officers, politicians, and informants benefited from the underground economy. Raids were selective, investigations stalled, and witnesses disappeared. This corruption created a system where power wasn't just about strength. It was about knowing who to pay, who to threaten, and who to protect. Ordinary residents were caught in the middle. Many relied on the underground economy to survive, especially when legitimate opportunities were scarce due to segregation and discrimination. As a result, figures like Bumpy Johnson were sometimes viewed not just as criminals, but as providers and protectors in a system that had failed them. By the time of the shooting, Harlem's power structure was a tense web of alliances, rivalries, and unspoken rules. One wrong move could trigger retaliation from multiple sides: local crews, the mafia, or law enforcement. The shot that would later echo through history didn't happen in isolation. It occurred within a system already stretched to its breaking point. In the days leading up to the shooting, Harlem was already on edge. Rumors moved faster than facts, and whispers of betrayal circulated through clubs, back rooms, and street corners. Something had shifted in the balance of power, and those who lived by the code of the streets could feel it. When conversations grow shorter and eye contact disappears, violence is usually close behind. At the center of this tension was a dispute that refused to stay quiet. Whether it involved money, territory, or respect, the issue had crossed a line. Meetings were requested, then avoided. Messages were delivered indirectly, stripped of politeness and loaded with warning. Each side began preparing for the worst, knowing that compromise was no longer guaranteed. Bumpy Johnson was not a man who ignored signs of danger. He adjusted his routines, limited his public appearances, and relied more heavily on his inner circle. His bodyguard's presence became constant, no longer symbolic but necessary. Every room was assessed, every face evaluated, every movement calculated. Those around Bumpy felt the pressure intensify. Allies grew nervous, unsure where loyalties truly lay. Some feared retaliation from higher powers, others worried about being caught in the crossfire. In Harlem's underworld, neutrality was often interpreted as weakness or worse, betrayal. Outside forces also added fuel to the fire. Rival crews saw opportunity in instability, while mafia interests monitored the situation closely. Any sign that Bumpy's control was slipping could invite intervention. The streets sensed this vulnerability, and that knowledge made the atmosphere even more volatile. The moment before violence is often marked by silence, and this was no different. Conversations stopped abruptly. A meeting was set under tense conditions, with no guarantees of safety. Those present understood that the outcome would redefine boundaries, one way or another. When the trigger was finally pulled, it felt inevitable to those who understood the signs. The shooting wasn't spontaneous. It was the release of pressure that had been building for weeks. In that instant, Harlem's fragile balance shattered, and the consequences would ripple far beyond the sound of the gunshot. The moment arrived without warning, but not without cause. Those who were present later said the air felt heavy, as if everyone knew something irreversible was about to happen. Words were exchanged, brief and tense, carrying more weight than volume. In Harlem's underworld, it was never the shouting that signaled danger, it was the calm. Bumpy Johnson stood composed, as he often did, letting others reveal their intentions first. His bodyguard, positioned close enough to act, but far enough not to draw attention, watched everything. A hand moved the wrong way. A step came too close. In that split second, instinct overruled hesitation. The gun was raised and fired at point-blank range. There was no dramatic pause, no warning shot, just a sharp, explosive sound that cut through the room and froze everyone in place. The distance was so close that the outcome was decided the instant the trigger was pulled. For a brief moment, time seemed suspended. No one screamed. No one moved. Shock held the room hostage as reality caught up with what had just happened. In that silence, everyone understood the gravity of what they had witnessed. This was not just an act of violence. It was a declaration. The bodyguard did not linger. His role was never to explain or justify, only to act. The decision had been made long before the trigger was pulled. This was merely its execution. Loyalty, duty, and survival converged in that single second. Bumpy Johnson's reaction was controlled, almost detached. He had seen enough violence to know when a line had been crossed and could not be undone. There was no celebration, no regret shown publicly. Only the understanding that consequences would follow, and they would be severe. That one shot echoed far beyond the walls of the room. Word spread quickly through Harlem, reshaping alliances, silencing rivals, and reinforcing reputations. The trigger pull marked a turning point, not just in a conflict, but in the balance of power itself. From that moment on, nothing would be handled the same way again. By the time the gun was fired, the situation had already passed the point of reversal. In Harlem's underworld, conflicts followed an unspoken timeline warning, pressure, and then action. Every signal had already been sent. Messages were ignored, boundaries were crossed, and the usual channels for resolution had failed. When that happens, violence stops being a choice and becomes an outcome. The central issue was not just a single dispute, but the threat it represented. Allowing that moment to pass without action would have been interpreted as weakness, not just toward the immediate threat, but toward every rival watching closely. In a world built on reputation, hesitation could dismantle years of carefully maintained authority in seconds. Bumpy Johnson understood this reality better than most. His power depended on the belief that crossing him carried consequences. If that belief cracked, the fallout would have been immediate. Challenges from rival crews, interference from higher powers, and internal doubt among his own people. The cost of inaction was far greater than the cost of violence. For the bodyguard, the calculation was even more direct. His role was not to judge motives or outcomes, but to prevent harm before it reached Bumpy. When a situation escalates beyond control, bodyguards are trained by experience to act decisively. Waiting for certainty in moments like that often means waiting too long. The environment itself contributed to the inevitability. The meeting space, the tension, the history between those involved, everything compressed into a narrow margin for error. One wrong movement in such conditions can be interpreted as a lethal threat, especially when past betrayals and vendettas are still unresolved. There was also the matter of precedent. Harlem's streets had long memories. Similar situations in the past had ended violently, and those outcomes shaped expectations. Everyone present understood the rules, even if no one spoke them aloud. Once those rules were broken, enforcement was expected. In the end, the shot was unavoidable because the system demanded it. Power, fear, loyalty, and survival all pointed in the same direction. The trigger pull was not an emotional reaction or a reckless act. It was the final step in a chain of events that had been set in motion long before anyone entered that room. In the seconds after the gunshot, the room fell into a stunned silence. No one rushed forward, and no one spoke. In Harlem's world, reacting too quickly could be just as dangerous as reacting too slowly. Those present understood that the moment did not belong to them anymore. It belonged to the consequences that were already unfolding. Word of the shooting traveled fast, carried not by newspapers, but by people. Within hours, whispers moved through barbershops, clubs, and street corners. Details changed with each retelling, but the core message stayed the same. A line had been crossed, and Bumpy Johnson's authority had just been reinforced in blood. The streets responded with caution. Rival crews pulled back, choosing silence over confrontation. Meetings were postponed. Territory disputes were suddenly forgotten. No one wanted to be the next example. Fear settled in, not chaotic fear, but controlled fear, the kind that restores order through restraint. Bumpy's allies closed ranks. Trusted lieutenants checked in, reassured operations, and watched for retaliation. The bodyguard disappeared from public view, protected by the same silence that had always shielded Bumpy's inner circle. In Harlem, anonymity after violence was a form of survival. Ordinary residents reacted in more complicated ways. Some felt uneasy, reminded of how close violence always was. Others saw the shooting as confirmation that outsiders and disruptors would be dealt with swiftly. For better or worse, many believed the streets would be calmer afterward, and in the short term, they were. Law enforcement felt the shift as well. Increased patrols appeared briefly, but without witnesses or cooperation, there was little progress. Officers knew the pattern. When the streets went quiet, it usually meant the truth had already been buried. In the days that followed, Harlem adjusted. Life continued, but with a sharper awareness of boundaries. The shooting became part of the neighborhood's unspoken history, a reminder that power was still firmly in place, and that some moments, once they happen, redefine everything that comes after. In the immediate wake of the shooting, law enforcement moved quickly, at least on the surface. Patrols increased, detectives canvassed the area, and questions were asked in the usual places. But beneath the activity was a familiar reality. Everyone already knew how this would end. Harlem had seen this pattern before. Witnesses were scarce because people hadn't seen anything, but because silence was safer than truth. Doors stayed closed. Statements were vague. Memories failed suddenly and collectively. In a neighborhood shaped by fear, loyalty, and long-standing distrust of police, cooperation was not an option. Detectives understood the wall they were facing. Without witnesses, weapons, or willing informants, cases like this quickly stalled. Files were opened, notes were taken, but momentum faded fast. The shooting joined a long list of violent acts that existed on record, but not in resolution. Corruption also played its quiet role. Certain officers had relationships with figures in Harlem's underworld, arrangements built on favors, bribes, and mutual benefit. Raids were delayed, leads were ignored, and attention shifted elsewhere. Justice, in this environment, was selective. Bumpy Johnson himself was questioned indirectly, never aggressively. His reputation, connections, and legal insulation made him difficult to approach. Everyone involved knew that pressing too hard could invite consequences far beyond a failed investigation. Publicly, the incident faded from headlines almost as quickly as it appeared. No arrests were announced. No official conclusions were drawn. The silence from authorities mirrored the silence from the streets, creating a shared understanding that the matter was closed, unofficially but completely. In the end, the lack of resolution spoke louder than any verdict. The unanswered questions reinforced the belief that real power in Harlem did not belong to the courts or the police, to those who controlled the streets. The silence became part of the legacy, as telling as the gunshot itself. Single gunshot did more than end a confrontation. It reset the balance of power in Harlem. In an underworld built on perception, the message was immediate and unmistakable, and Bumpy Johnson's authority was absolute, and challenges would not be tolerated. The shot closed one chapter and opened another, defining how power would be enforced going forward. Rival crews recalculated their positions almost overnight. Ambitions were quietly abandoned, and potential challengers chose survival over pride. The shooting served as a warning without the need for further violence. In that sense, ACT reduced open conflict, replacing chaos with controlled fear and strict boundaries. The relationship between Harlem and the Italian mafia also shifted. The incident reinforced Bumpy's reliability as a partner who could maintain order without constant oversight. His autonomy, already rare, became more entrenched. Harlem was no longer just a territory. It was a system managed by someone who understood both street politics and larger criminal structures. Within the black community, the shooting deepened Bumpy Johnson's complicated legacy. To some, it confirmed him as a dangerous criminal. To others, it reinforced the belief that he protected Harlem from outside exploitation. The moment blurred the line between oppression and protection even further, embedding itself into neighborhood lore. Law enforcement, faced with silence and stalled investigations, adjusted their expectations. The lack of resolution sent a clear signal that traditional policing had limits in Harlem. This reality influenced future strategies, often relying more on surveillance and long-term cases rather than immediate arrests. Culturally, the shooting became part of Harlem's oral history. Stories were passed down, reshaped, and mythologized, turning the moment into legend. It wasn't just remembered as violence, but as a turning point, the day Harlem's rules were reaffirmed. In the years that followed, the impact of that single shot continued to echo. It influenced how disputes were handled, how power was respected, and how history remembered Bumpy Johnson One trigger pull didn't just change a situation, it reshaped Harlem's identity, leaving a mark that time never fully erased.